Hello all. Once again, I wanted to run through some example practice questions for you in advance of the Unit 3 Physiology Exam. I'm not going to review the Unit 3 Anatomy. I know that's really the more extensive part of Unit 3, but you guys have plenty of review activities on Blackboard. And one major tip, don't overlook the Unit 3 Skeletal Anatomy practice test that's available to you on Blackboard as well, and you can take that multiple times. And so in addition to the other practice activities that you have, you've even got bone practice in your Mastering A&P homework as well. Don't overlook taking the practice test. You'll regret it if you do overlook that. All right, again, with the skeletal anatomy, I know there's a lot of it. That's just the way it is with the skeletal system, and practice makes perfect. So you just gotta over and over and over again use those quizzing resources to make sure that you can identify all of the things on the Unit 3 Anatomy Study Guide and you know how to spell them correctly. All right, meanwhile, over on the function side for the skeletal system and also our joints, the first question here, this is one of those select all of the following that are true about hyaline cartilage, one of those kinds of questions that everybody hates. So again, when you see these, and you will see them, if in A&P and micro, and if you continue on into a health sciences school like nursing school, you're going to see them pretty frequently. So you have to kind of get used to answering these. And again, when you have a question like this, what you want to do is just go down the list and treat each of those answers like a true-false. And if it's true, then you pick it. All right, so select all of the following that are true about hyaline cartilage. All right, how about A? Hyaline cartilage is produced by osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Hopefully you're thinking no on that one. Osteoblasts are the cells that produce your bone matrix. Osteoclasts, remember, are your bone dissolving cells. Osteoblasts are the bone makers. Osteoclasts are the bone degraders, bone eaters. So we don't want to choose that one. They're not involved in cartilage production. So we're going to X that one out if I can get my stylus here to write. Present on the ends of long bones. Yes, you have those articular cartilages on the ends of your long bones. You know that better as gristle, and that is hyaline cartilage. How about C? Has a better blood supply than osseous tissues. All right, if you think about the composition of hyaline cartilage, you've got those chondrocytes, those cells inside the cartilage, and then they're surrounded by a little chamber called a lacuna. And then you've got what's often referred to as a semi-solid type extracellular matrix surrounding those cells, but there are no blood vessels within the cartilage itself. You have blood vessels that are in the covering, that perichondrium covering around the outside of the cartilage, but you don't have blood vessels passing through the hyaline cartilage itself. Your osseous tissues, on the other hand, are well vascularized. Vascularized means that blood vessels are present in the tissue. Bone has a very good blood supply. So this one's going to be false. We're not going to pick that one. Forms templates of most of the bones in the embryonic skeleton. That's true. When the skeleton is developing, when you're an embryo and a fetus, most of the bones in the body start out as hyaline cartilage templates, and then they go through that endochondral ossification process to become bone tissue or osseous tissue instead of cartilage. Connected to the shafts of most ribs, your rib cartilages, yes, those are composed of hyaline cartilage. Composes the menisci of the knee joints. Remember, your menisci is plural, so at each knee joint you have two menisci. Meniscus is singular, and you've no doubt heard of somebody before probably who has torn a meniscus in his or her knee. That's pretty common. But that's not hyaline cartilage. It is cartilage. Do you remember what type of cartilage it is? It's actually fibrocartilage. So it's still cartilage, but as the name suggests to us, there are more of those protein fibers located in there than what you would have in hyaline cartilage. So that's going to be a no. That's one of those cases where you'd have to read really carefully, because you might be thinking, oh yeah, the menisci of the knee joints are made of cartilage, but this question is asking you specifically about one type of cartilage, the hyaline cartilage. So you got to be really, really careful when you're reading. Don't zip through the test. Remember, fibrocartilages are located at places where you need some cushioning. You also have that in your in between your vertebrae. G, the mitotic cells of the epiphyseal plates or discs. So epiphyseal plates, you want to be sure that you know that term. No epiphyseal disc and no growth plate. All of those things mean the same thing. So unfortunately, a lot of times in biology, we have multiple terms that refer to the same thing. The mitotic cells, so those are your dividing cells, are located in hyaline cartilage. That's true. Yeah, the cells that are actually dividing in the growth plates and causing long bones to get longer when those growth plates or epiphyseal plates are open, those are actually cartilage cells that are undergoing the division and elongating the tissues. And then those newly created hyaline cartilage tissues in the growth plates undergo an ossification process. They get converted over to osseous tissue. All right, so that one's a yes. And then how about H? All joints in the skeletal system contain hyaline cartilage as part of their structures. And hopefully you're thinking no on that one. Most of them do, but because most of your joints are synovial joints in the body, and at those joints you have articular cartilage on the ends, the gristle, I'm sorry, and that's composed of hyaline cartilage, but not all joints in your body fall into that category. Okay. All right, and I am going to put these questions up for you, just the PowerPoint in addition to this video on Blackboard, so you'll have these if you want to go back and use these questions to help you review. Just remember, these are not identical to test questions. They're just examples. They are helping us review the concepts that you'll be tested on when you take the Unit 3 Physiology exam. So this is A&P is not, the anatomy side is memorize and regurgitate. The physiology part is not. So you've got to get used to studying in such a way that you're actually learning and understanding the concepts and not just trying to memorize and regurgitate terminology. All right, the hematopoietic tissues of the body are called blank and are found in blank. And hopefully, hematopoietic is a long word, but hemato refers to blood, which you will learn a lot more about when you take Biology 202. And poietic or poiesis is referring to production, creation. So your hematopoietic tissues are the tissues in the body where your blood cells are created. And so is that going to be red marrow or yellow marrow? We'll narrow it down. Hopefully you're thinking red marrow. The red marrow those are the tissues where blood cells are made. And where do you find them? Among these choices, your correct answer is going to be, you would find them in the spaces between the trabeculae of spongy bone. Remember, the trabeculae are the little T-shaped subunits in spongy bone that give spongy bone that spongy-like character. So in the spaces in between those trabeculae, this is where you have your red marrow in many parts of the body. Now when you're younger, or when you're first born, you have red marrow in many other locations as well, but as you get older, red marrow tends to get replaced with yellow marrow. Okay, reviewing your long bone structure. So one thing you want to do, there are on the physiology test, there are questions that use these diagrams from your textbook. So don't just learn the words, be sure you're putting the terminology, these words and phrases, to an actual structure that you can identify on a diagram so that you actually understand what those are. So for example, epiphysis. Where do we see an epiphysis on the diagram? Remember the epiphyses right there and right there. Those are on the ends of your long bones. The diaphysis, that's this skinnier central part of the long bone. Periosteum. All right, so over here we've got a blow up of this area of the bone. The periosteum is a connective tissue covering that you have around the outside of the bone, so that kind of bluish colored layer that they're peeling off there is the periosteum. The endosteum, where would you find that? The endosteum is actually going to be inside here, lining the cavity. You're going to have another thin layer of connective tissue. Endo means inside. Spongy bone. Spongy bone looks like that. Let me erase. Okay. Spongy bone blown up for you here. Where do you have spongy bone? You have spongy bone in the epiphyses of your long bones. And you also have lesser amounts of it if you look closely inside the bone surrounding the medullary cavity inside there. Remember, that's another name for the cavity, the space inside your long bones. Trabeculae, we just talked about that. Remember, trabeculae is plural, trabecula is singular. So over here, each of these kind of T-shaped structures is a trabecula. Trabeculae with an E, that's a Latin pluralization of the word. Compact bone, that's the denser bone where you don't have the spaces between the subunits like you do in spongy bone, and you tend to have that around the edges of your long bone. So right over in here, cut open, there's some compact bone running up and down the outsides of the long bones. All right, review our compact bone structure here, the different parts of the long bone. Remember, compact bone is built from these 3D cylinders called osteons. Those are the subunits. And right there, they're pulling an osteon out. So it's kind of, it doesn't really do that, but what they're doing that to show you that an osteon is a long cylinder, and it is composed of rings, like they're showing you over here, of osseous tissue that radiate outward, almost like tree rings, and they surround a central canal in each osteon. The central canal will have an artery, a vein, and a nerve. That's what you're seeing there in yellow. Compact bone also has perforating canals within it, and those are like right there and right there. And that allows a passageway for blood vessels from one central canal to another. And again, all of this is involved in making sure you've got a good blood supply within these osteons in the compact bone. The osteocytes, remember cyte, C-Y-T-E, refers to cell. So right there you got an osteocyte, there's one over here, there's one over here. So they're sitting along those rings within the osteon. And then remember that the osteocytes have little appendages that pass through canaliculi. That's a plural term for little tiny canals, these things that look like cracks between the rings of osteocytes. And each osteocyte is sitting inside a fluid-filled chamber. It doesn't extend very far outward from the cell, but that is also called a lacuna, just like your chondrocytes and cartilage are sitting in a little fluid-filled chamber as well. And again, the canaliculi allow these osteocytes to contact each other, and hopefully you remember the function for that. And that's because, all right, so your cells within the osteon right in here that are close to this artery that you see there in red, they're easily able to pick up oxygen gas and nutrients from the artery. Those things are going to diffuse over to those cells pretty well. These poor little cells that are way out here in the rings farther away from the central canal, it's not as easy for oxygen gas and nutrients to diffuse through that that solid osseous matrix to get to them. So the way these cells in the outer rings get their oxygen and nutrients is through those little projections that they send through the canaliculi. So all these cells are reaching out and touching each other, and that allows them to pass oxygen and nutrients outward through the rings, and then also wastes get passed inward because the wastes have to get picked up by the blue vein there and carried away from the bony tissue. Waste will include carbon dioxide, that's a waste, and then also other waste products that cells generate just as part of their normal everyday activities. All right, here's a select all that apply question about a lateral injury to a long bone. So a lateral injury means a side injury, not an uncommon type of injury to have. How about this one? Trabecular bone. Trabecular bone is another term for spongy bone, so just keep that in mind. You may see both of those terms used. There's another term, cancellous bone. I hardly ever use that one. That's another term that also refers to spongy bone as well. But all right, so A, trabecular bone provides the greatest resistance to compression forces. All right, so your lateral injury, the bone's bending in like this, you're going to get some compression there on one side as that's happening. And hopefully you're thinking no on that. That's one of the main reasons why you have compact bone along the sides of your long bone. So if they get hit in a lateral direction, it helps avoid compression. B, collagen fibers in the osseous tissue matrix will help the bone resist bending to the point where it breaks. Yes, hopefully by now you're catching on to this function of collagen, because we've talked about this in Unit 2 and Unit 3. Collagen provides tensile strength, and it helps resist pulling and bending. So that one is definitely going to be true. Collagen fibers are not elastic. Remember, your elastic fibers are the ones that allow tissues to rebound after they get stretched. Collagen fibers are helping to resist pulling and bending. All right, C, the medullary cavity let's just say experience, not experiences, will experience the strongest forces, which is why it has to be filled with red marrow. Yeah, that one's not going to be true either. Your strongest forces are going to be around the edges, and that's why you have compact bone in those locations. And in fact, it's the opposite, because the center does not experience the strongest forces. That's why you can have that lighter medullary cavity filled with marrow in that location. D, hydroxyapatite crystals will play an important role in the bone resisting being crushed. Yes, go back and review your file. Why do we have hydroxyapatite crystals? Those are the calcium phosphate crystals that give osseous tissue the hard consistency. And that's certainly one of its main roles, is to help bone resist being crushed. How about E? Blood vessels will likely be damaged and break if the blow to the bone is strong enough. That's definitely true. Go back and look at your bone healing stages, and you will certainly see in those pictures, if bones break, bone is vascularized, you've got blood vessels in it, that's going to cause bleeding, and the first thing that's actually going to happen is a blood clot is going to form first when a bone begins to heal. All right, how about this one? The trabeculae of spongy bone are arranged according to the stresses placed on the bone where they are located. True or false? That's, hopefully you're thinking true on that one. So what that means is, when spongy bone is developing in the body, bone is synthesized along stress lines. You know, the way your skeletal system is having to support your weight, there are certain lines of stress that occur as your body has to resist gravity for you to be able to walk around and do your daily business. And so the spongy bone actually forms along those stress lines to provide as much support as possible without actually having to have a completely solid matrix like you have in compact bone. So it's very, very efficient. All right, one thing you do want to do is go back and review the stages of endochondral ossification. That's what you're seeing here. Remember, most bones in the body are created or formed through endochondral ossification. So I'm not going to go back and read through all of these steps. I just put this in here to remind you about those general stages. And they're showing you over here in blue. Remember, that's hyaline cartilage. So that's what an early bone looks like in an embryo, and then it goes through this multi-stepped process of being converted over into bone. And then as a young child, the hyaline cartilage that you have left from that original template will be here along the edges, the articular cartilage, the gristle on the ends of the long bone, and then remember you've got a little strip of hyaline cartilage that's left over, and that's mitotic at each end. Those are your epiphyseal plates. Here's actually an image of growth plates on an X-ray. So if you have an X-ray taken of a long bone before your growth plates have closed, you will actually see the growth plates on the X-ray. Of course, your bones look white on an X-ray, but notice the little darker areas right there and over here. Those indicate open growth plates on the X-ray. And so remember, in a child or an adolescent who still has, or even a young adult, if growth plates haven't closed yet, you don't want those growth plates injured because that could affect the elongation of the bones. So remember, growth plates are essential for longitudinal or lengthwise growth of the bones. They don't impact what's called appositional growth. Go back and review that terminology as well. That's bone widening. So that can continue to occur after the growth plates have closed. All right, and do go back and again review what actually goes on in an epiphyseal or growth plate. And what they're showing you here, this is actually what a growth plate would look like under the microscope if you blew it up and looked at the tissue. And remember, right in here, that's where you've got cartilage cells that are undergoing division, and they kind of exist in these columns. So new cells, these are resting cells up here. These cells down in here are undergoing mitosis, and they're dividing and kind of pushing the older cells downward like this. It's kind of like what goes on in the skin. Remember how the epithelial cells kept getting pushed upward and upward and upward? Here they're the cartilage cells are moving downward as the growth plate continues to expand. And further down, the cartilage cells are becoming calcified, so calcium gets deposited around them by osteoblasts. That kills the cartilage cells, and then those dead cells have to be carved out. They have to be removed by who's gonna carve out calcium deposits? Who are your bone dissolving cells? Your osteoclasts. And then osteoblasts come back in and they deposit the more mature osseous tissues. So go back and review what's happening in the growth plates. All right, how about this question? Select all of the following that are true about osseous tissue formation. All right, how about A here? Osteoblasts synthesize the extracellular matrix of osseous tissues. Yes, osteoblasts are your bone forming cells or bone synthesizing cells. Osteoclasts secrete the calcium ions into the extracellular matrix. That's going to be a no. Osteoclasts are your bone dissolving cells. They're not going to be involved in bone creation. The osseous they're not involved in the osseous tissue creation. The osseous extracellular matrix is first synthesized as osteoid, which later calcifies. That's actually true. If you go back and look, osteoid contains the protein fibers There are protein sugar combinations in there called proteoglycans, like chondroitin sulfate. You may have heard of people taking that before as a supplement. That's present in the osteoid. And so it's an organic but not hardened matrix. And then the calcium phosphate crystals, the hydroxyapatite crystals, develop in there and harden it and convert it into the osseous tissue matrix. Okay, D, there are no organic molecules in osseous tissues. Nope, that's false. We just mentioned some of the organic molecules in your osseous tissues, like collagen fibers, for example, or proteins. Those are organic molecules. Osseous tissues contain water and fluids. Yes, you have water essentially everywhere in your body. There's no part of your body that is dry like stone. And so even within bone, even within the osseous matrix, even though you're used to seeing it maybe if you've been in a lab before with bones, they're dry, but that's because they've become dehydrated over time. Inside the human body, the osseous tissues are hydrated and contain water in them. Osseous tissues have a rich blood supply. Yes, we've mentioned that several times. All right, Melvin and Wileen are having a baby and receive a printout of a scan of their 3-month embryo. As Melvin and Wileen gaze lovingly at the scan, they can't help but think about which one of these. Because, of course, everybody thinks about this when they see a scan of their 3-month embryo. How about A? The parietal bones of the skull are converting from sheets of fibrous connective tissue to osseous tissues. That sounds good to me. I'm going to put a check by that one. Let's read through the rest of them, though. The skeleton of their teeny-weeny embryo has almost completely ossified. No, ossification takes quite a bit longer to take place. C, the skeleton may be almost entirely hyaline cartilage right now, but that stuff will be gone as soon as the growth plates close when this kid hits age 20 or so. It is true most of the skeleton is hyaline cartilage, but will hyaline cartilage be completely gone when you hit age 20? No, you still retain some of the hyaline cartilage. Remember, along the ends of your long bones, as an example, your rib cartilages are also hyaline cartilage as well. So is your nose cartilage. The long bones of the embryo will ossify first in the epiphyses and later in the diaphyses. Nope, that one's false as well. Remember, your diaphyses ossify first. The epiphyses will ossify later. Your epiphyses, if you go back and look at the primary ossification center, that's in the diaphysis. That's where the conversion of the hyaline cartilage bone into an osseous bone begins. And then the epiphyses have what are called secondary ossification centers. So ossification will occur later. This information can be used to help date an embryo. If you look at the skeleton and how much of the skeleton has ossified versus what's remaining non-ossified, that can help you figure out how mature an embryo or a fetus is. All right, during endochondral bone formation, most of the interior of long bones contain spongy bone at first, but almost all of it is carved out by osteoclasts later. That's actually true. If you go back and review the diagram, spongy bone gets laid down first, but then the osteoclasts come in and carve out most of it because they're going to create that medullary cavity. All right, hormone regulation. So hormones are very important for bone growth. You got a little bit of hormone stuff to learn here in Biology 201 while you go over the skeletal system. When you get to Biology 202 and study the endocrine system in more detail, you're going to learn a whole lot more. But some of the important hormones, growth hormone stimulates epiphyseal plate activity. That just makes sense. This is a hormone that stimulates growth, so it's going to stimulate mitosis of cells and tissues that are growing. And so that makes sense. The thyroid hormone, you guys no doubt have heard that The thyroid controls your metabolism. So higher thyroid hormone levels will cause an increase in your metabolism. And so thyroid hormone actually influences growth hormone. Since thyroid hormones increase metabolism, if you're growing, you have growth taking place, you need a higher rate of metabolism. You need to break down nutrients more quickly. You got to do cellular respiration more frequently to make all that wonderful ATP that you need to energize, to power all of this growth that's taking place. So thyroid hormones are important for bone growth. Testosterone and estrogens, those are your sex hormones. Testosterone is the primary male sex hormone, and then estrogens are the primary female sex hormones. And these hormones stimulate growth plate elongation. So they're responsible for the growth spurts that occur in both adolescent boys and girls. But then later, interestingly enough, they trigger the epiphyseal plates to close. And keep in mind, you know, a key reason why on average females are shorter than males on average is because their epiphyseal plates close earlier, and that's because estrogen stimulates them to close sooner than testosterone does. All right, calcium homeostasis review. Let's go through this. This is something you want to go back and review and make sure you understand the story. On the physiology side, you need to start practicing. When we have a concept like this that's a step-by-step concept, you need to learn that pathway or that concept and make sure you can explain it or write it out or diagram it out. That's the only way to know for sure that you have it down pat. All right, so what they're showing you here, the seesaw here is supposed to represent calcium levels in the body, calcium ions. Remember, calcium ions are very important. Go back and review that as well. We talked about several reasons why calcium ions are so vital to your survival. And so your body is very good at regulating calcium ion levels in your body fluids. So what happens is if calcium ion levels have dropped, and calcium ions are sometimes written as a Ca with 2 pluses. That's because it has a double positive charge. It's actually lost 2 electrons compared to a neutral calcium atom. That's why it's written that way, in case you were wondering. And all right, so you got these little bitty glands on the back of your thyroid gland called the parathyroid glands. Most people have 4 of those, and they detect calcium levels. So when calcium levels drop, you have cells in those parathyroid glands that release a hormone called PTH, which is an abbreviation for parathyroid hormone. All right, and that's actually a protein that travels through your blood, and hormones are, many of them are proteins, not all of them, and you'll learn more about that when you study the endocrine system. But what hormones do, there are certain cells in the body that when they're contacted by the hormone, they respond to it. They undergo some sort of a change. And so over here, these little guys over here, hopefully you're recognizing those as osteoclasts. This hormone, when it contacts the osteoclasts, it stimulates the osteoclasts to secrete acids along the edges of your bones, and that breaks down osseous tissue matrix. It breaks down those hydroxyapatite crystals where you have calcium ions stored, and that causes calcium ions to be released into your body fluids. They get into the blood, and your calcium ion levels go back up. So that's the key story of calcium homeostasis. So it's primarily controlled by these little bitty parathyroid glands and this hormone that they make called PTH, parathyroid hormone. All right, how about this one? Select all of the following that can lead to bone resorption. So that's a term you certainly need to be familiar with. Resorption, that's where you're breaking down osseous tissues. So let's think through this one. Low calcium levels in the bloodstream. Yes. If you have low calcium levels in the blood, we just went over calcium homeostasis and how that works. Elevated levels of calcitonin. If you had high levels of calcitonin. Calcitonin is another hormone that is, it's actually made by the thyroid rather than the parathyroid. It's thought to maybe have some minor role in controlling calcium levels in the body, but its function was originally thought to be when you had high calcitonin, that stimulated bone formation instead of bone resorption. So calcitonin is not going to be triggering bone resorption. That's going to be the job of PTH. If you were a hermit and you lived in a dark room, we got some critical thinking to do there. If you were a hermit and you lived in a dark room, if you're in a dark room, what are you not getting exposed to? Hopefully you're thinking sunlight and good old UV light from the sun. Exposure is down. And what did UV light trigger the production of in your skin? Hopefully you're thinking vitamin D. Your vitamin D levels are going to go down. And what does vitamin D help you absorb from your diet? Calcium. So that means your calcium absorption from the diet is going to go down. All right, and if your calcium levels are down, then yes, you're going to have to start resorbing bone matrix and dissolving calcium out of the osseous tissues to bring the level back up. So that one's going to be a yes. Let's think about this one. Hyperparathyroidism. Remember, hyper means elevated. Elevated what? Elevated PTH. We just talked about how PTH stimulates osteoclasts to dissolve bone matrix. So if you have elevated PTH, then absolutely that is going to trigger bone resorption. And if you truly have hyperparathyroidism, like if you had a tumor on your parathyroid that was aggressively making tons and tons of PTH, it could lead to osteoporosis. You could break down so much bone matrix that it would trigger that condition. How about the reshaping of a healing bone fracture? Yes, that's part of the bone repair. Go back and take a look at that as well. Osteoclasts are involved in the shaping of bones. Bone resorption takes place to help restore bones to their original shapes. Osteoclasts performing their normal functions. Yes, bone resorption, that's what they do. They trigger bone resorption. That's their job. All right, a patient you are working with has experienced a traumatic injury to the anterior side of her cervical region. Do you remember where the cervical region is? It's not the cervix, it's the neck. Yeah, your cervical region is the neck. A butterfly-shaped organ and surrounding tissues were completely destroyed. Gee, I wonder what we could be talking about here since we just saw the picture. Which of the following conditions may be triggered by the loss of these tissues? This is a good critical thinking question as well. So you got the butterfly-shaped organ, that's your thyroid. And remember, the parathyroid glands are attached to that. So if the thyroid gets destroyed, then very likely your parathyroid is going to get destroyed as well. So let's, you have no parathyroid. That's going to be the key here. All right, and what does that mean about, let's just think through this. So if you have no parathyroid, you're going to have low levels of PTH. Remember that PTH is very critical for helping to bring the calcium levels in your body fluids back up when they go down. All right, so A, will you have hypercalcemia? No, you will not have hypercalcemia, because if you have low PTH, you're not going to be dissolving as much calcium out of your bone matrix and releasing it into your body fluids. So you're not going to have hypercalcemia, but you might have, if you look down here at choice number E, hypocalcemia, because hypo means low. Osteoporosis? Probably not. Low PTH activity means low activity of osteo what? Hopefully you're thinking osteoclasts, your bone dissolving cells. So if they're not very active, that reduces your risk for osteoporosis because you can't degrade your bone matrix very well. You're probably not going to care about that because you're going to be having problems controlling the calcium levels in your body fluids, which will be causing you much more immediate problems than osteoporosis would. A vitamin D deficiency? No. Oops, answer popped up there. Vitamin D is produced in the skin due to ultraviolet light, so you wouldn't likely have a vitamin D deficiency. Osteomalacia, yeah, if you go back and look, that's a condition of soft bones where you're not able to create calcified bone matrix very well. But this patient's not going to have that problem. This patient is having a problem with osteoclasts not functioning, not breaking down bone matrix. So they're not going to have a problem with soft bones. So the correct answer there was just E. Hypocalcemia would be the problem. All right, a patient has arrived in the ER with an injury in the coxal and upper femoral regions. A bone, this is a reading question, a bone is protruding from her skin on the lateral side of her upper thigh, so it's broken through the skin. An X-ray reveals a single subtrochanteric fracture perpendicular to the femur. The fracture has completely severed the bone. Select all the following that apply about this injury. So this is a good reading question. So this is one of those you don't want to zip through too quickly. So we've got injury in the coxal and upper femoral regions. Bone is sticking out from her skin on the lateral side. An X-ray reveals just one subtrochanteric. Do you know what that means? Subtrochanteric. Can you figure what does trochanteric remind you of? Hopefully you're thinking the greater trochanter, that big process that sticks out from the upper part of the thigh near the ball or the head of the femur. This fracture is going to be perpendicular, so it's across the femur. The fracture has completely severed the bone. All right, so is this a compound fracture? So it's broken through the skin, so that's a yes. A compound fracture is one that has broken through the skin. Is this a comminuted fracture? It doesn't sound like it because this a comminuted is where the bone gets crushed. How about a green stick? No. The wording of this question tells us that this is a completely broken, completely severed bone right there, completely severed. A green stick fracture is where the two bones, the bone has not completely broken apart. Is it a complete fracture? Yes. So the bone's broken all the way across. It's been broken into two pieces. And is it a transverse fracture? Yes, because it says it's perpendicular. Got your femur here. It's going across like that. It's perpendicular to the bone. So yes, that is a transverse fracture. All right, put the following stages of bone fracture repair in the correct order. Do we remember which order these go in? Which thing is going to happen first if you have a broken bone? Hopefully you're thinking hematoma formation. That's first. Hematoma is the clinical term for a blood clot. So you're going to have to clot your blood and close off the bleeding first. And that's going to be number one. And then do you remember what's going to happen next? The blood clot gets cleared out. And then you have what's called a fibrocartilaginous callus or a soft callus. That forms next. So that's soft tissue. That's a temporary, kind of like a template that's put in there. And it's called a callus because it tends to be wider than the bone that it's originating from. So it sticks out. Then what's going to happen? Then that fibrocartilaginous callus or soft callus gets converted into a bony callus. So that's number three. And then finally, you've got to reshape or remodel the bone. That's where your osteoclasts really kick in, and make sure that you don't have excess bone that you don't need. Your skeletal system tries to be pretty efficient in most cases if it's operating normally. So a broken bone will generally revert back to its original shape pretty well because this remodeling takes place so efficiently. A lot of that's dictated by gravity, the stresses, the forces that are placed on the bones help determine how that remodeling is going to take place. All right, a key reason why reduced estrogen levels lead to osteoporosis. Go back and review what we discussed about osteoporosis. And so which one of these looks like the correct answer? All right, osteoporosis, that's telling you during osteoporosis, your osteoclasts are more active, your osteoblasts tend to be less active. You're supposed to have this balance between bone synthesis and bone resorption. They're supposed to be balanced for your skeletal system to remain intact and for you to maintain a normal bone density. As you get older, though, and especially in females, the osteoclast activity is jacked up. Osteoblast activity tends to be reduced. And so because of that, osteoporosis can develop as the bone matrix gets dissolved. And so which of these is the key reason? I'm going with B. Estrogen helps keep your osteoclast activity at normal levels. So when estrogen levels fall in females as they get older, that's what allows the osteoclasts to start going crazy and dissolving more bone matrix. Lurleen is 8 months pregnant, and Finster, her devoted husband, has been drinking a 12-pack every night because of Lurleen's mood swings. What abnormal spinal curvature do they both likely have? So what do you think? Lurleen's 8 months pregnant. Finster's been drinking a 12-pack every night, so he probably looks like he's 8 months pregnant as well. He's got a big old beer belly. So which of those would you associate with what kind of spinal curve? What will the spinal column do? Down in that lower area, down in the lumbar area, it's going to bend in an anterior direction to try to kind of shift the center of gravity to help support the larger abdomens on both Lurleen and Finster. And that condition is called lordosis. Kyphosis, do you remember what that one is? That's the exaggerated curvature up here at the top of the spinal column, like the hunchback type curvature. That's kyphosis. And you see that a lot in females with osteoporosis as they get older and the vertebrae, the bone matrix in the vertebrae is degrading due to the osteoporosis. The spinal column cannot support as much weight, so they tend to get that kyphosis, that hunchback. Scoliosis, that's a lateral curvature of the vertebral column. So if you were looking at somebody from behind, the spinal column bows out that way or that way. Lumbrosis, I just made that up. That's not even a real word as far as I know. Okay, let's see. Which of the following apply about, this is a joint question, which of the following apply about the pubic symphysis? The pubic symphysis. All right, so let's go through these. Multiple answer. Is this a this is a joint. Is it a diarthrotic joint? Diarthrotic means the joint is freely movable. You have good motion at the joint. And do you have good free motion at the pubic symphysis? Hopefully not. We're going to X that one out for sure. Is that a cartilaginous joint? Yes, you have a fibrocartilage pad at that joint. Is it a synovial joint? No, because we just said it's one of the cartilaginous joints. Is it the joint between the two ossa coxae? Ossa coxae, that's the plural form of os coxa, and those are your two pelvic bones, left and right, or your two hip bones, left and right. And yes, that is the joint between those two. Is this an amphiarthrotic? Let's look at E and F. Amphiarthrotic and synarthrotic. So which of those two? It's one of those two. We've already said it's not diarthrotic. Hopefully you're thinking amphiarthrotic on this one, which means that you do have some limited motion at the joint, which is good, because if you did not, then females would have a tough time with childbirth if there was no motion at the pubic symphysis. Synarthrotic, that's an immovable joint. Several bursae are present at this joint. Bursae is plural for bursa. And no, we didn't really talk about bursae being present at the pubic symphysis. All right, synovial joint review. Take a look at this diagram. I know this video is getting kind of long, so I'm going to try to speed up through the rest of it. But take a look at this diagram in your textbook and make sure that you understand the composition of your synovial joints, these different tissues that you see here, like the synovial membrane in green, the articular cartilage there in blue at the ends of the bones. You've got the synovial fluid on the inside, and then you've got the fibrous connective tissue joint capsule around the outside that's shown there in purple. But just remember, the joint is 3D, and they've cut this open so you can see the inside. So you have to imagine all these things wrapped around in 3D. But do go back and review the parts of a synovial joint. Let's take a look at this question. Select all of the features or properties of the knee joint. So remember, you don't have to, the joint chapter, we covered selected topics. If you're reading along in the textbook, there's a lot more information in there, and you could spend a really long time studying the joints in detail. And no doubt, if you're going into PTA, physical therapy assistantship, you're going to learn a whole lot more about joint structures than what we've covered in this class. But in preparation for this test, be sure you're going by the study guide and the PowerPoint information, the lectures that we went over, because I did narrow down the joint information quite a bit. All right, is the knee joint a type of synovial joint? Yes, it certainly is. Falls into that category. Is it ball and socket? No, it is not a ball and socket joint. Where are the two ball and socket joints that we learned about? Shoulder, and then also your hip joints, where the head or the ball of the femur meets that little pocket in each os coxa. Remember what that's called? The acetabulum. All right, is this an amphiarthrotic joint? No, it's fully movable, and we just said the term for that is diarthrotic. Remember, arthro refers to joint, like arthritis, inflammation of joints. Bursae help protect and cushion the joint. Yes, you've got bursae around the knee joint, more than one. And remember, bursitis, you'll hear old people talk about how their bursitis is acting up. That's an inflammation of a bursa or bursae around a particular joint. The menisci help protect or cushion the bone surfaces at the joint. Yeah, we just talked about those a little bit earlier. Do you have synovial fluid? Absolutely. And that synovial fluid helps lubricate the joint, helps provide nourishment. The synovial fluid absorbs nutrients and oxygen gas out of the blood, and so it helps provide those to the cells that are living there inside the joint. And synovial fluid, remember, also kind of has a consistency like egg white, so it's not a thin liquid. All right, is the knee joint the joint between the tibia and the fibula? Hopefully you're saying no to that. It's the joint between the tibia and the femur. And do not, on your anatomy test, say fibia and tibula. I know somebody's going to do that. Be real careful about that. It's very easy to do. I do it too. Try not to do that when you're typing in an identification of one of those bones on the exam. Plane joints are freely movable around several axes. So those are, yeah, plane joints between bones in your wrist, as an example. And hopefully you're thinking false on that. Definitely not. They are not freely movable around several axes. They're sliding joints. The joints can kind of slide, the bones can kind of slide across each other. Here's a question that you can figure out if you have studied your skeletal anatomy well, and you can recognize and recognize the parts of words that are being used here, what word roots are being used, and deduce where something would occur. At which major joint would you expect to find the coracoacromial ligament? So hopefully this is reminding you of the coracoid process and the acromion. So where would you find it? Where do you... That's going to be a ligament between the coracoid process and the acromion process of the scapula. So what joint does the scapula participate in? Hopefully you're thinking the shoulder joint for that one. And you may have one or two questions like that on the test where if you know the names of bones and bone features, you can figure out, even though you haven't had to study the detailed anatomy, this is still good practice, clinically, real-world application, because when you hear about like coracoacromial ligament, you may never have had to identify that from a picture or on a model. But you should be able to figure out, acromial, acromion. Coraco, that sounds like the coracoid process of the scapula. This must be a ligament between those two features on the scapula. Oops, wait a minute. Oh, I skipped over one. I thought, did I just give out? Did I have that answer in wrong? Here's another one. At which major joint would you expect to find the iliofemoral ligament? All right, ilio sounds like ilium. Femoral refers to femur. So this is a ligament that's extending from the ilium, part of the os coxa, the pelvic bone, down to the femur. So at what joint are we going to find that ligament? Hopefully you're thinking about the hip. All right, sprains are bone fractures that don't actually separate two pieces of bones. Nope, that's wrong. A sprain is going to be an injury to a ligament or tendon around a joint. And what about healing? Think about that. Sprain injuries versus broken bones. Remember, your tendons and ligaments are composed of dense, regular connective tissue. Does that have a good blood supply? Hopefully you're shaking your head. No, you don't have any room for blood vessels because there are so many collagen fibers within that tissue. They've filled up all the space. There's no room for blood vessels to grow in there. And so tendons and ligaments have a poor blood supply. So if you rip those, you tear them at a joint due to a sprain, they don't heal very quickly. It can take a lot longer for a sprain to heal than for a broken bone to heal. Here's I think this is the last question, a matching question about the different types of arthritis. So be sure you review those. And osteoarthritis is which one of these? That's just normal wear and tear arthritis. So you're having inflammation. Anytime you have damaged tissues inside the body, that triggers inflammation and all the symptoms of inflammation like pain and swelling and heat generation and so forth, because the cells of your immune system are going to swarm in there and try to clean up the damage, just like they would try to swarm in and kill bacteria or viruses or whatever if you had an infection there. So that's just normal aging wear and tear. You know, as your joints wear out as you get older, the bones start rubbing against each other, cartilage starts rubbing on cartilage, bone on bone, and that's going to cause injury and damage, and so you're going to develop osteoarthritis as that occurs. Gouty arthritis. Gout, you've probably heard of somebody having gout before. People with gout have deposits of uric acid crystals. Uric acid is a waste that's generated mainly from the breakdown of DNA and RNA in our cells. And you're supposed to pee that out, as the name kind of implies. But in some people, they can have excess amounts of this that get deposited in their joints, unfortunately. And then the uric acid crystallizes. If you think about, like, if you put a bunch of sugar into iced tea and you know it's cold and it can't really dissolve very well. Same thing with these uric acid crystals. Not that your joints are cold, but they can't stay dissolved in your joint fluids properly, and so they'll form these crystals, kind of like sugar or salt crystals. And they can be sharp, so they damage the soft tissues at the joint, and that causes inflammation. Lyme's disease, or Lyme disease, that's caused by a type of bacteria. So that's a type of bacterial arthritis. And rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disease. That's where your immune system is unfortunately attacking your joint tissues, just like it would attack something foreign to the body, like bacteria or a virus or a fungus. Anytime you see rheumatoid, that's generally referring to an autoimmune condition. If you ever have to go to if you ever have an autoimmune disease like lupus, for example, you would have to go see a rheumatologist. That's a specialist in those types of diseases. All right, that looks like that's the end of our Unit 3 Physiology review. Now, some of the questions in here were pretty tough, and that was to help us review some of the more difficult concepts. But try to make sure you understand everything that we talked about in this review video, why the right answers are the right ones, and why the wrong ones are the wrong ones. That's a good way for you to study using these questions, the other practice activity questions that are available to you on Blackboard, and also your Mastering A&P homework questions. Go back to those and study in that way as well. Do I know why the right answer is the right one and why the wrong ones are the wrong ones? And if you don't, that's a big red flag. You need to go back and review those topics in more depth before you actually take the test. If you have any questions or concerns, again, as always, I would love it if you guys would use the Piazza discussion board more frequently and post things there so that other students can benefit. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions or concerns.